You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 495th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich, and Tracy, once again, won't be with us this week. As you guys will recall, last time it was because she had a cold. This time it's because she's out of town visiting family. I, however, am here at home holding down the fort, so, yep. It's just me again. All right, so if you're still listening, by the end of May 1864, both the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia had suffered the most severe and sustained casualties of their existence. Neither side as yet knew the full extent of those losses, although during the heavy rains that drowned the countryside and brought operations to a halt at mid-month, Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade had gotten a shocking glimpse from the earliest official field returns. Those reports tallied the Army of the Potomac's remaining strength and its losses since the opening of the campaign. Now, leaving aside Sheridan's cavalry and the recent reinforcements from Washington, for which no returns were yet available, the Army, including Burnside's Ninth Corps, numbered 56,124 men. Casualties for the month to date came to 3,814 killed, 22,298 wounded, and 10,733 missing, for a total of 36,872, or about 36% of the men who had crossed the Rapidan just 12 days earlier. Now, that figure is simply staggering. It was higher by 13,000 than the federal casualties at Gettysburg. No one could be presented with such a number without reflecting upon it, and Grant voiced regret that so many men had been lost. Meade's pragmatic response was, "Well, General, we can't do these little tricks without losses." Well, Meade sounded tough and professional, while Grant sounded uncharacteristically soft-hearted. But of the two, Grant's reaction more closely grasped the big picture. All military campaigns involve casualties, and the Civil War had already spawned death and injury on a scale never seen in North America. But few campaigns are defined by their casualties. Antietam, notorious for being the war's bloodiest single day, is equally recalled as paving the way for the Emancipation Proclamation. Gettysburg, the war's bloodiest battle, has gone down in popular history as the Confederacy's high water mark. But the Overland Campaign, like Verdun in the First World War, remains synonymous with sheer, unrelenting bloodletting. Union General Robert McAllister wrote, "This is a hard campaign, putting in the shade all the others." A South Carolinian agreed, calling it the most severe and awful time we have ever experienced. And from the opening battles in the wilderness all the way to its conclusion at Cold Harbor, the Overland Campaign's preeminent feature was the scale of human suffering. That suffering could be seen most vividly on the roads that led away from the battlefields. Those roads were filled with wagons and ambulances, slowly making their way to the rear with their loads of bandaged, blood-stained soldiers. The burden of caring for the wounded lay heavy on both armies, but of the two, the Confederates had the more manageable task. They suffered fewer casualties, and in almost every instance, they held the battlefield after the fighting ended. The levels of medical equipment and supplies in the Army of Northern Virginia appears adequate, notwithstanding Sheridan's destruction of a large store of medical supplies during his Yellow Tavern raid. But most important, the Confederate Army enjoyed simple, secure, and relatively short transportation links to the network of nearly 50 hospitals established all over Virginia, especially the 8,000-bed medical complex on Chimborazo Hill outside Richmond. And so a rebel soldier wounded in battle could generally expect to receive initial treatment at an aid station, then at a field hospital not far behind the lines, followed by a few hours' journey by ambulance to a rail station, then a quick train trip to an army hospital. The sheer crush of wounded men was a problem, to be sure, since by May 24th, Virginia's military hospitals contained over 18,000 patients, but by and large, the Confederate medical evacuation system functioned smoothly. While the Confederate medical evacuation system, by and large, functioned smoothly during the Overland Campaign, the situation was much worse on the Federal side of the lines, since the Federals had to contend with a greater number of wounded and also had by far the more difficult challenge of getting them to the large, permanent Union military hospitals in cities far behind the front lines. The medical director of the Army of the Potomac, Thomas McParland, was an able administrator with 60 officers, 2,300 enlisted men, and nearly 800 ambulances at his disposal, to say nothing of the almost 700 regimental and brigade surgeons not under his direct command. They all crossed the Rapidan River with 8 days' worth of medical supplies, sufficient to handle an estimated 20,000 casualties. But the campaign wasn't a week old before McParland had a serious crisis on his hands, and before things got better, they got considerably worse. The structure in place for battlefield evacuation normally took a wounded man through 3 main stations. First, the field hospitals at regiment or sometimes brigade level, where he received initial care and was operated upon if necessary. Then the division and corps hospitals, and finally the general hospitals with extended care facilities. Washington had 16 of those hospitals by 1864, while nearby Alexandria had 7 more. Ordinarily, the wounded would have gone directly from the field to a general hospital, but during the Overland Campaign, evacuating them quickly was impossible because such normal evacuation depended on the maintenance of regular line of communications. However, the decision, at the end of the fight in the wilderness, to transfer the Army of the Potomac's base to Belle Plain meant that the line stretching back to Culpeper could no longer be used. This denied wounded men a relatively short wagon trip over well-maintained roads and a speedy journey by train to Washington. Instead, they would have to go by way of Belle Plain, with an initial stop at Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock River, about 10 miles from the Wilderness and Spotsylvania battlefields, and then not quite as far again to Belle Plaine. This new evacuation route was an improvised makeshift affair, and it had several serious drawbacks. It was longer and far more cumbersome than the Culpeper route. It ran through territory recently held by the Confederates and only tenuously controlled by the Federals, as it was still full of rebel cavalry and guerrillas. And it required the creation of a fourth stage in the evacuation process, a so-called depot hospital system to provide intermediate medical care until transportation could be arranged to get the wounded to Belle Plaine and aboard steamers for the trip up the Potomac River to Washington. Unfortunately, the depot hospital at first existed only in theory. No one was at Fredericksburg to set one up before the first wagon loads of wounded arrived. Making matters even worse, some wounded had started the journey to Culpeper before the orders were revised, which gave them an extra 24 hours on the roads. And a bleaker interim destination than Fredericksburg could scarcely have been found. Although it was the nearest town of any size, it had been ransacked by Federal troops and shelled heavily during the battle there in December 1862, and many damaged roofs still stood open to the heavy rains that poured down during the second week of May 1864. The final stretch of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad ran northeast of the town to Aquia Creek, near the river that was its partial namesake. And that railroad, however, had been wrecked after the Union Army departed from the area in June 1863 and had not been rebuilt. A dirt road led from town directly to Belle Plaine, but all the bridges across the Rappahannock were down, and anyway, the road was deeply rutted, and the constant jostling of the wagons would have been torture for the wounded and would have killed outright the more severely injured. Moreover, that road constituted the Army's single avenue by which to receive supplies and reinforcements, which meant that wagons and ambulances bound for Belle Plaine would compete head-on with troops marching to the front and wagons carrying rations, ammunition, and other supplies. For all these reasons, the Federal wounded piled up at Fredericksburg. An estimated 14,000 had arrived by May 12th, and once there they experienced some of the most wretched conditions of the entire war. Most of the Army surgeons remained with the frontline units, so trained medical professionals were in short supply. Initially, the wounded were not even placed in private homes. The officer in charge was apparently leery of aggravating the citizenry, which were still furious at the Yankees for ruining their town a year and a half earlier. So he decreed that civilian residences could only be used if the owners volunteered them, and almost none did. The Civil War occurred at a time in American history when public needs routinely outstripped government resources. To bridge the gap, concerned citizens often created aid associations, and hundreds existed by 1860. The war spurred the creation of many more, including the United States Sanitary Commission, which was established in June 1861 to aid sick and wounded Union soldiers, and to lobby the Army's medical department to institute a better standard of care. By 1864, the Sanitary Commission had 500 agents in the field, and a network of convalescent camps, branch offices, and over 7,000 affiliated chapters across the North and even in the occupied portions of the Confederacy. It financed its operations through donations and massive sanitary fairs that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars. The New York Metropolitan Fair, held on the eve of the Overland Campaign, alone had brought in over $1 million. So the commission was sufficiently well funded to staff and maintain 5 ambulances permanently with the Army of the Potomac. It also sent a number of doctors and nurses directly to Fredericksburg as soon as it learned that wounded men were there. The commission workers, accompanied by members of a similar organization, the United States Christian Commission, began arriving in Fredericksburg around May 12th. And what they found was appalling. Nurse Cornelia Hancock, already a veteran of the field hospitals at Gettysburg, wrote her sister that, quote, "the scenes beggared all description." Hancock wrote, quote, "Rain had poured in through the damaged roofs of the churches until our wounded lay in pools of water made bloody by their seriously wounded condition." She quickly organized a work party to saw up the church pews into improvised cots so that the men at least wouldn't have to lay on the floor in the water. To her mother, she wrote, "I am the first and only Union woman in the city. The secesh help none. There is suffering equal to anything anyone ever saw, almost as bad as Gettysburg." Another woman who witnessed the scene at Fredericksburg was Clara Barton, a relief worker who had created her own relief organization, one day to be called the American Red Cross. But on this occasion, she signed on with the Massachusetts Relief Agency, an association specifically to help soldiers from the Bay State. On the road from Belle Plaine, however, she stopped to help the first of the wounded being taken down to the river landing, and once she arrived at Fredericksburg, she took in the situation in one indignant glance, and as fast as she could boarded a steamer back to the capital. Once in Washington, she accosted Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson and told him in no uncertain terms that the situation at Fredericksburg was a scandal. Brave Union boys were dying in the rain, she said, and an officer had informed her that, quote, "it was in fact a pretty hard thing for refined people like the citizens of Fredericksburg to be compelled to open their houses and admit these dirty common soldiers, and he was not going to compel it." End quote. Well, Wilson was outraged, and he stormed straight over to the War Department and told Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that if the department didn't take action at once, the Senate would. So Stanton promptly dispatched Brigadier General Montgomery Meigs, the Army's Quartermaster General, with full authority to do anything needed to rectify the situation. Meigs arrived at Fredericksburg on May 15th, and he wasted no time in forcing the local residents to open their homes to take in the Union wounded. He also ordered the construction of a second pontoon bridge to join the one that had already been built, and he spurred efforts to rebuild the railroad to Aquia Creek, and finally sent to Washington for additional supplies. By May 23rd, Meigs' efforts had worked wonders, and wounded men were streaming from Fredericksburg via wagon to Belle Plaine and by railroad to Aquia Creek. However, by then, the Army of the Potomac had left Spotsylvania, and new orders arrived to move the depot hospital to Port Royal, a village on the Rappahannock, just 17 miles as the crow flies southeast of Fredericksburg, and far easier for the Army to screen from its new position on the North Anna. Most of the medical workers therefore went to Port Royal, but the new depot was barely up and running before orders came to transfer everything yet again to White House Landing, which served as the Army's base of operations once it crossed the Pamunkey. Well, needless to say, the experience of the average wounded soldier caught up in this nomadic, makeshift system was necessarily pretty bad. But this was in keeping with the general state of Civil War medicine, which we covered in some detail way back in episodes 61 and 62. Most doctors serving with the armies were dedicated to their craft and familiar with the increasing knowledge about physiology and pathology. And recent decades had witnessed the routine use of safe anesthetics, such as ether and chloroform, which both reduced the patient's distress and made more time-consuming, complicated surgical procedures possible for the first time. As a result, Civil War surgeons were capable of impressive feats. But medical science was still a few years short of the discovery that germs and bacteria were at the root of most disease and infections, and that rigorous antiseptic hygiene could dramatically boost the patient's odds of survival. Tragically, hundreds of thousands of sick and wounded soldiers paid for that missing information with their lives during the Civil War.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. It's the ultimate bundle for an unbelievable price. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. Get it and watch Marvel Television's Ironheart on Disney Plus.
I want to build something iconic.
A new season of The Bear on Hulu.
We can make people happy.
And The Epic, a Minecraft movie on Max.
Anything you can imagine is possible.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. All these and more streaming soon. Terms apply. Visit DisneyPlusHuluMaxBundle.com for details.
Going up.
Prices keep going up these days. It feels like being on an elevator that only goes up.
Going up.
But not at Metro. We're pushing the down button.
Going down.
We've lowered prices. Get one line of 5G data for $40, period. That's 20% lower. And you get a free Samsung 5G phone when you bring your number. Only at Metro.
5-year guarantee on eligible plans. Exclusions apply. See website for details. Not available if at Metro with T-Mobile in the past 6 months. Tax applies.
During the Wilderness Campaign, many of the federal wounded fell into Confederate hands, where they often suffered from inadequate care. In large part, this was because the rebels, understandably, gave priority to their own men. A chaplain with the Louisiana Regiment who visited some Union wounded on May 17th reported that, quote, they were in a miserable condition. Many of them were several days without having their wounds dressed. The situation could be bad even when, as generally happened, Union surgeons stayed behind to look after their charges. By military custom, these men were regarded as non-combatants and therefore could perform their duties unhindered. But nevertheless, other complications arose. For example, Dr. William Watson, who stayed behind in the wilderness to care for around 275 men, sent an urgent request through the lines for replenishment of his dwindling stock of food and medical supplies. However, he was told that nothing could be sent without Ulysses S. Grant's express permission, presumably because the Federals thought the Confederates might use those supplies. Watson reported that the rebels, for their part, declined to provide anything, correctly pointing out that, quote, nothing prevented us from receiving supplies from our own lines, end quote. So, in desperation, Watson sent a second message, saying that many of the wounded had already died for lack of food and supplies, and that, quote, if relief is not afforded the men, they will die of sheer starvation. Well, it's not known whether anyone sent the food and supplies Watson pleaded for, but Watson himself spent 3 weeks in the wilderness in Confederate hands, before returning to friendly lines. However, the wounded in his care who survived joined the more than 19,000 men on both sides who, during the campaign, became prisoners of war. In previous campaigns, many of these POWs would have been paroled, but as we've talked about on the podcast, the agreement regarding prisoner exchanges had started to break down when the Federals started to enlist significant numbers of black soldiers, who, when captured by the Confederates, were often treated essentially as runaway slaves. As a result, the Federals suspended the agreement in May 1863. It continued informally for several months. For example, Grant paroled the Confederate Vicksburg garrison to save him the trouble of shipping 30,000 POWs to northern prison camps. But although it continued for those several months, it collapsed entirely when some of those Vicksburg parolees returned to duty without being properly exchanged. From that point on, the POW camps, north and south, began to fill up, while Federals and Confederates wrangled over the Vicksburg parole irregularities and the treatment of black Union soldiers who fell into rebel hands. However, the two sides showed no signs of reaching an agreement, and as a result, the armies embarked on the spring campaigns of 1864 in the certainty that capture by the enemy would mean many months of imprisonment. Of the many engagements of the Virginia campaign, the Wilderness was the one in which by far the most soldiers were captured. It was a big battle anyway, and the tangled, confused terrain meant it was common for individuals and sometimes whole units to be separated from friends. Once a man found himself caught up in a situation where capture seemed imminent, he had just seconds to consider the number and position of adversaries and the chances of a successful escape. Union Major Charles Maddox described just such a moment. Trying to supervise a detachment of skirmishers in the dense woodlands, Maddox lost his way and stumbled headlong into a regiment of Confederate infantry barely 40 yards away. Come in," they shouted at him. Well, Maddox, who was mounted, considered making a break for it, but figured, quote, "The thick bushes and the brook would impede my progress more than that of 200 or 300 bullets. It was but a short moment, but I had time to weigh all the chances. It was simply death or capture, and I very ungallantly chose the latter. I raised my hat and started toward them." Others, finding themselves in such a predicament, elected to flee. A fortunate few even turned the tables. Seeing that he and 17 of his men were about to be cut off during the fighting on May 5th, for example, Major Holman S. Melker of the 20th Maine gathered them in a huddle, explained the situation, and finished, "Now, my men, as for myself, I had rather die in the attempt to cut our way out than be captured to rot in rebel prisons. Will you stand by me in this attempt?" Well, they agreed, charged toward Union lines, and after a confused running battle, not only reached safety, but took 32 rebel captives. Those captives had made their own split-second estimate, guessed wrong, and quickly regretted it. Melker wrote, quote, "When our prisoners discovered how few were their captors and how near their many friends, they slackened their pace, refusing the orders to double quick, and seemed inclined to turn on us." But Melker's drawn pistol served to dissuade them. And that was not the only such incident. Down by the Orange Plank Road, the 7th Pennsylvania Reserves charged the enemy so aggressively that it outran its neighboring regiments and became isolated. Called upon to surrender, the 7th's colonel decided he had no alternative. he and 325 others lay down their arms, only to discover that they had been captured by 2 understrength Georgia companies, perhaps just 50 men in all. Away from the wilderness, surrenders usually occurred in the context of an enemy breakthrough. The classic example being the sudden capture of 3,000 men at the Mule Shoe. Such situations were far more delicate and dangerous because soldiers passed almost instantaneously from furious resistance to hoped-for surrender. A single wrong move could make an attempted capitulation look like treachery. For example, in danger of being overrun by the May 12th Union assault, Confederate Captain McHenry Howard ordered his men to fire a volley, then abruptly regretted it as he realized the enemy's strength was overwhelming. Surrender seemed the only choice, but in that instant, at least one of Howard's men obeyed his just given order and fired. The smoke from the musket's discharge, Howard recalled, quote, seemed as if it would never dissipate, end quote. And for a breathless second, he thought the Federals would exact a penalty for, quote, our firing when we were practically captured. Dozens of blue-clad soldiers had surrounded Howard's trench, and they now brought their bayonets down, but only, it turned out, quote, for the purpose of sweeping aside the bayonets of our men, which were resting on the top, and we were ordered to scramble out. Once captured, prisoners went first to a holding area maintained by the Provost Guard, which was the 19th century version of military police. And when enough had been assembled, they were marched away from the battlefield on foot. In the case of the Confederates captured in the wilderness and Spotsylvania, this meant a trip to Fredericksburg and then to Belle Plaine, where they were temporarily held in a large circular valley known as the Punch Bowl. There they were visited by the curious, including James Gardner, an employee of famed cameraman Matthew Brady, who photographed them for posterity. And Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles also visited, along with a gaggle of other VIPs on May 15th. Ever the Connecticut Yankee, Welles sized up the prisoners as, quote, rough, sturdy-looking men, good and effective soldiers, I should judge. Most of them were quiet and well-behaved, but some few of them were boisterous and inclined to be insolent. End quote. Well, the presence of roughly 7,500 Confederate POWs in Grant's logistical pipeline undoubtedly complicated the already daunting task of evacuating the wounded and supplying the army, but it could not be helped. And Lee's Provost Guard, at least in the wilderness, had a better solution. Instead of marching Union POWs south along their main supply line, they instead hiked them 30 miles west to Orange Courthouse, where they were placed on railway cars and dispatched to points south, mostly to a new POW camp of which few had yet heard, Camp Sumter in Georgia, better known as Andersonville. The equivalent of Andersonville, in terms of the most common destination for Confederate POWs taken in Virginia, was Point Lookout, Maryland. In addition to wounded men and prisoners, the campaign produced at least 12,000 corpses. One might conclude, rather coldly, that the suffering of these men was over, but their deaths visited pain on countless families and friends. More prosaically, their rotting bodies often nauseated comrades yet living. Most soldiers who fought in the Overland Campaign were veterans of previous battles. They had seen death before, and even the sight of mangled corpses was not unusual. But because the fighting at Spotsylvania and later Cold Harbor kept them in the same trenches for days at a time, they found themselves eating, drinking, and sleeping in the immediate presence of hundreds of unburied bodies. And this, for most of them, was something new. The sheer number of bodies was shocking, and the air hung heavy with the smell of death. After the wilderness fighting, Federal troops were able to bury only those comrades who had died within friendly lines, which meant that most of the Union dead remained in the thickets and fields. In June 1865, when a detail under Captain J.M. Moore reached the Wilderness and Spotsylvania battlefields soon after the end of the war, they found that by that time many of the corpses had been temporarily interred, some by Union cavalry that passed through a month after the battle, others by local farmers who performed the burials through agreement with federal authorities or simply to reduce the stench. Captain Moore noted that at Spotsylvania most of the corpses had been buried by one Mr. Sanford, in compliance with an agreement made with Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had passed through the area with his army after the final Confederate surrender. The situation in the Wilderness was different. There, Moore and his men established two military cemeteries, one on the Orange Turnpike and the other on the Orange Plank Road, both where the fighting had apparently been fiercest. Moore noted, quote, "It was no unusual occurrence to observe the bones of our men close to the abatis of the enemy, and in one case several skeletons of our soldiers were found in their trenches. The bones of these men were gathered from the ground where they fell, having never been interred, and by exposure to the weather for more than a year, all traces of their identity were entirely obliterated." End quote. Moore impartially buried and reburied Union and Confederate dead alike, with name, rank, and regiment on their grave markers if available. If not, then with the standard inscription, "Unknown U.S. soldiers, killed May 10th, 1864, in the case of the Federals who could not be identified. But this too proved a temporary arrangement. In a few years, the Union dead were removed to a permanent military cemetery established at Fredericksburg, which became the final resting place for 15,273 Union soldiers killed in the four major battles in the area: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. More than 83% of the dead are listed as unknown. Some of those killed later in the campaign wound up at the Cold Harbor National Cemetery. No Confederate dead were permitted in those cemeteries. After the war, local women formed associations to create special resting places for them. 600 in a little cemetery just northeast of Spotsylvania Courthouse, 3,300 more, including 2,184 unknown in the Confederate Cemetery in Fredericksburg, while still others joined the 30,000 Confederates buried at Oakwood and Hollywood cemeteries in Richmond. And I think that's where we'll start to wrap up this show. Next time, we'll see how, for the soldiers who remained with the armies as May wore on, what increasingly dominated their psychic landscape was fatigue, anxiety, and sheer misery. We'll talk about how every Civil War campaign brought hardship, but the relentless stress associated with the Overland Campaign stunned everyone who took part in it. That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is The Encyclopedia of Civil War Medicine by Glenna R. Schroeder-Line. As always, you guys can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find info on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade and support the podcast in that way, just like Mike, Ken J., Raphael S., Casey S., Vinay V., Aaron, and Grouse K9 have all done recently. Well, thank you, one and all. And all right, that's it. Short and sweet this time, since I am ready to wrap things up. I do hope you tune in next time, but until then, take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye.